This is a table saw. It's a table with a saw. Get it? Table saw.
A table saw can make rip cuts, which is a cut along the grain of the wood. The table saw can also make crosscuts, which is cutting against the grain of the wood. The table saw can make very precise cuts when used correctly. The table saws in our shop have a saw stop feature, which means that if you touch the blade while it's running, it will stop immediately. A cartridge inside the saw will trigger, putting a break into the blade. It destroys the blade, but it saves your finger. How does it do this? Well, when you touch the blade, it senses conductivity in your finger, sends a signal to a computer, and the computer says, "Hey, you, release this spring." Bang. End of finger cut. One of the first things you might notice about the table saw is this spinning wheel of doom that sticks up out of the table, just waiting to hack off your fingers. Don't worry, I'll show you how to be safe with it. Other dangerous thing about this tool is that it has a round blade, which means it has infinite tangential forces. Say that 3 times fast. Infinite tangential forces. One's good enough. Okay, basically that means wherever the blade touches the wood, that's the direction of the force. A tangent is a line that touches a circle at exactly one point. So if my wood touches here, it's going to try to push the wood down. If the wood touches here, it's going to try to push the wood across. If the wood touches here, it'll try to push the wood up. So as you're feeding your wood through the blade, it's reaching many different angles, and so the predictability of where that wood's going to go is, well, it's pretty low. It's very unpredictable. Okay, now we do a lot of things to protect against that, but you have to know what they are. Unlike the bandsaw, if I were to start this cut and let go, it would shoot this wood out towards me, leave me with a very uncomfortable bruise. Okay, if I'm cutting in a straight line, even if I'm holding it, if this were to twist against the blade ever so slightly, part of the wood will be pushing up against the non-cutting part of the blade. So you have this kerf that it cuts, and the teeth are slightly wider than the blade, so it creates a channel where it's not rubbing against the side of the blade. But if I'm cutting and I suddenly steer into that part of the blade with no teeth, it's no longer cutting and now it's just rubbing, and it's going to try to force us back in something known as kickback. On the table saw with a saw stop, the kickback is really the most dangerous thing we have to fear. When you touch the blade, the saw detects the moisture in your hands, setting off a cartridge that deploys a brake, stopping the blade, but also destroying the blade in the same process. It's not just your fingers that will set off the saw stop, but also wet wood. It acts just like fingers. Anything that's made out of metal, such as nails, will also set it off, and any material that's got a foil backing will set off the saw stop. So don't use any of those materials in the saw stop, unless you want to buy new parts for it, I guess. No, don't even do that. One important thing to know is the saw stop will not prevent a kickback. So if you put a board in crooked, it's going to come flying out. The saw stop will not protect you. When you're done cutting your material and you turn off the power switch, the saw stop is still active. That fast blinking green light tells you it will still trigger the cartridge if you touch the blade. Wait until the blade comes to a complete and total stop before touching your wood. The solid green light indicates it's safe to reach and clear material. Always wear safety glasses when using this tool. Also tie your hair back above your shoulders. The tool's on, your fingers need to stay more than 4 inches away from the moving blade. That's about the distance between the blade and the T-track. If you're cutting a board narrower than 4 inches, let's say I want to make this cut right here, you'll use a push stick. And that way your fingers can stay 4 inches away. Make sure that the board is completely against the fence and that the board has been jointed. It has a nice straight edge.
If you try to use an uneven edge against the fence, the board could rock and you'd get a kickback. Kickbacks are painful. Ask me why I know. I've had a couple. Never try to rip cut a board that is less than 6 inches long. The board could go sideways in the blade, and as soon as it stops going straight, you're going to get a kickback.
Raise the blade 1/4 inch above the wood. This is just enough so the saw teeth protrude just above the wood. Start by turning on the dust collector to protect your lungs and the machines.
When making a rip cut, hold the board firm against the fence. Make sure there are no gaps anywhere along the fence. Using your push stick if the board is narrow. Make sure the board is not touching the saw blade when you turn it on. Turn the saw on.
Push the board all the way through the saw until it clears the back of the blade, and lift your hand up and away from the blade. Then turn off the saw, and most importantly, wait for it to stop. Keep waiting, keep waiting. As soon as that green light stops blinking and the saw blade is completely stopped, it's safe to reach in and grab your work. When you're done working, if nobody else is using power tools, be sure to turn the dust collector off. However, if people are still working, leave it on so we can all breathe safely. There are several ways to make a crosscut safely on the table saw. The most common way is using a miter gauge. It can be found here on the front of the table saw. Insert the miter gauge into the T-track on the table and hold your work firmly against the miter gauge. Turn on the saw and cut through, keeping your fingers at least 4 inches away from the blade. Here's a dangerous situation. Never use the miter saw and the fence together. It could very easily bind up the wood, causing this terrible thing called, wait for it, a kickback. Use either the miter gauge or the fence. In our shop, we also have the large sliding miter table. This works just like the miter gauge, only it's permanently attached to the table and can handle much larger materials. The most important part of the table saw, of course, is the saw blade. But also important is this power cutoff switch. If we're doing any kind of maintenance, we'll want to turn this off first.
On the front of the machine, there are 2 power switches. This big one that says, hey, look at me, pay attention to me, and the smaller one that's like trying to hide from you. This one right here, this little one, turns the computer on and off. Notice I don't have a little yellow key in it. So if I turn this off, I can't turn it back on without walking all the way over to wherever I hide the key and turn it back on. So we'll leave this on for the duration. When I come up to use the saw, I'm going to pull this lever out, this big one that says, hey, look at me on this big, huge thing, pay attention to me. This is how you turn on the saw. Turn the machine off, push that.
The best way to turn the saw off is to simply bump it with your hand. Just hit the button. But when you're working in an awkward position, you can also use your knee to turn off the table saw. These indicator lights will tell us the status of the saw. A solid green light means it's ready to go. Various combinations of flashing lights mean different things. There's a panel on the side that tells you what each one means. Generally, red is bad. When making a rip cut, you will always use a fence. This is what holds your wood steady against the blade and prevents you from having a kickback. The other important part of a table saw, of course, is the table. That's the flat part that holds your wood and keeps it from flying down to the ground. To adjust the depth of the blade, first loosen the center nut. Apparently I didn't film that. And then turn the handle to raise the blade to the desired height. Then tighten the center nut to hold it in place. Sometimes you'll want to cut what is known as a bevel or an angled cut. To make this, loosen the center nut and turn the angle adjustment until the indicator reads the desired angle. Notice the indicator is on the same location as the depth adjustment. And finally, we have the miter gauge. I know we've seen this before, but it's on the test, so I thought I'd show it to you again. Well, there you have it. Almost everything you need to know about a table saw, at least enough to get you started. Keep your fingers safe.